A fresh start. The sun had barely risen when Denise Harper pulled into the driveway of her new home on Pinnacrest Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac in the sleepy town of Briarwood. She parked her modest hatchback and stepped out, stretching her arms after the long drive. The neighborhood was as picturesque as the real estate agent had promised. Neatly trimmed lawns, perfectly painted houses, and tree-lined streets that exuded small-town charm. This was exactly what Denise needed after years of living in the hustle and bustle of the city. At 42, Denise was ready for a new chapter. As a single mother of 2 grown children, she had spent the better part of her life working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Now, with both of her kids off to college and a steady job as a librarian at the local university, she could finally settle into a peaceful life. She had always dreamed of owning her own home, and this quaint little house was perfect. It wasn't big or flashy, but it was hers, a symbol of the hard work and sacrifices she had made over the years. As she began unloading boxes from her car, Denise noticed a few neighbors peeking from behind curtains. She smiled and waved, hoping to make a good first impression, but no one waved back. It was odd, she thought, but she shrugged it off. Moving to a new place was always a bit awkward at first. People just needed time to warm up to her. By the afternoon, Denise had unpacked most of her essentials and was sitting on her porch, sipping a cup of tea. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for a Saturday. She had expected to see kids playing or hear the sound of lawnmowers, but there was nothing, just the occasional passing car and the distant hum of an airplane overhead. As she looked out at the neatly kept houses, she noticed a woman across the street staring at her. The woman was middle-aged, with meticulously styled hair and a floral apron tied around her waist. She stood on her porch, hands on her hips, glaring in Denise's direction. Denise waved politely, but the woman turned and disappeared inside without so much as a nod. Well, that was odd, Denise muttered to herself, taking another sip of her tea. Denise decided that maybe she needed to break the ice. In her old neighborhood, she had always baked cookies or a cake to welcome new neighbors, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to extend a similar gesture here. Baking was her way of showing kindness, of creating warmth and connection in a world that often felt too cold. Maybe that's what the people of Pinnacrest Drive needed, something sweet to break the tension. The next morning, Denise woke early, determined to make the best of her new situation. She went to the kitchen and pulled out the ingredients for her famous chocolate chip cookies, a recipe passed down from her grandmother. The aroma of vanilla and melted butter soon filled the air, and Denise smiled, imagining the surprised looks on her neighbors' faces when she showed up at their doors with fresh-baked cookies. She carefully packed the warm cookies into boxes, tied each one with a ribbon, and set off down the street. Her first stop was at the house of the woman who had been staring at her the day before. Denise took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door swung open, and the same woman stood before her, arms crossed over her chest. Up close, she looked even more severe, her thin lips pursed in a tight line, her eyes hard and cold. "Good morning," Denise said, offering her brightest smile. "I'm Denise Harper, your new neighbor. I wanted to bring you some cookies as a way of introducing myself." The woman looked at the box of cookies as if it were something distasteful. Her lips twitched, but she didn't smile. "I'm Mrs. Sutton," she said curtly, "and we don't eat sweets in this house." Denise's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, I understand. Well, if you change your mind, feel free to share them with your friends or neighbors." Mrs. Sutton's eyes narrowed. "I'm sure we won't be needing them." Denise felt the cold sting of rejection, but nodded politely. "All right then, have a wonderful day." Mrs. Sutton gave a slight nod and closed the door without another word. As Denise turned to leave, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in her chest. The cold reception from her neighbor was unexpected, but she wasn't going to let it ruin her day. She still had other houses to visit, and surely not everyone would be so unkind. But as she continued down the street, the responses from her neighbors were eerily similar. Some took the cookies with forced smiles, offering hurried thanks before shutting the door. Others simply refused, their eyes avoiding hers as they mumbled excuses. The warmth and friendliness she had hoped for never materialized. By the time Denise returned home, her spirit was deflated. She had moved here for peace and community, but it felt like she was intruding on a place where she didn't belong. Still, she wasn't one to give up easily. Tomorrow was a new day, and maybe things would be different. That evening, just as Denise was settling down to relax, there was a loud knock on her door. She frowned, not expecting anyone. As she opened the door, her heart sank. 2 police officers stood on her porch, their faces serious. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers said. "We've received a complaint about some suspicious activity in the neighborhood." Denise's mind raced. Suspicious activity. She had only been delivering cookies. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer glanced at his partner before speaking again. "We received a call about a woman going door to door. Some of the neighbors were concerned." Denise stared at them in disbelief. "Concerned? About cookies? I was just introducing myself to the neighbors," she explained. "I moved in yesterday, and I thought it would be nice to share some homemade cookies." The officers exchanged a look, as if they weren't sure how to respond. "Well, Mom," the second officer said slowly, "we just need to make sure everything is in order. Do you have ID on you?" Denise's heart pounded in her chest as she handed over her ID. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the unspoken accusation that hung in the air. Unspoken accusations. Denise handed her ID to the officers, her fingers trembling slightly as she did so. She had never been in trouble with the law before. The police had no reason to be here. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. How could delivering cookies, a simple, kind gesture, cause such an uproar? The officer examined her ID closely, then looked up at her, his expression neutral but his eyes searching. Denise could feel the weight of his gaze, a silent scrutiny that made her uncomfortable. "This is just a routine check," the second officer said, trying to sound reassuring, but Denise could hear the doubt in his voice. "We're just responding to a call. Nothing to worry about." But Denise was worried. The officer's words did little to ease the growing knot in her stomach. She had spent her entire life working hard to build a good reputation, to be kind, to stay out of trouble. And yet here she was, standing on her own porch, being questioned by the police as if she had done something wrong. "What exactly did the neighbors say?" Denise asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The first officer shifted on his feet, glancing down at his notepad. "There were a few reports about someone going door to door, acting suspiciously. One of the neighbors said they felt threatened." Denise blinked in disbelief. "Threatened? By me?" She could see the officers were uncomfortable. They were just doing their job, but it didn't make the situation any less surreal. "I'm a new resident," she continued, trying to keep her tone calm but firm. "I was only introducing myself and offering some cookies. That's all. I didn't mean to alarm anyone." The officers nodded, but Denise could tell they weren't entirely convinced. It wasn't their fault. They were responding to the calls they had received. But the reality of it stung. Someone in this neighborhood had felt so uneasy about her presence that they had called the police. Not because she had done anything wrong, but simply because she existed in their space. And that was enough to make them uncomfortable. After a few more uncomfortable moments, the officers returned her ID. "Everything seems to be in order, Ma'am," the first officer said. "We'll just let the neighbors know that there's no issue here. Sorry for the inconvenience." Denise forced a smile, though the tightness in her chest didn't allow for much. "Thank you, officers. I appreciate you checking in." With that, the 2 men tipped their hats and left, walking back down the driveway to their patrol car. Denise closed the door slowly, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Confusion, anger, sadness, and above all, a deep sense of isolation. She had moved here for peace, for a fresh start, But it seemed that no matter how far she traveled, the unspoken barriers of suspicion followed her. She sat down on the couch, her mind replaying the events of the evening. What had gone wrong? Had she come on too strong with the cookies? No, that couldn't be it. She had been polite, friendly, and respectful. Yet something about her, whether it was the color of her skin, the way she carried herself, or simply the fact that she was new, had sparked fear in the hearts of her neighbors. And that fear had escalated into a call to the police. Denise sighed, resting her head in her hands. She had faced this kind of prejudice before, of course. Growing up as a black woman in America, she had learned to navigate the unspoken rules of society, to be twice as good to get half as much respect. But somehow, she had hoped that this new town, this new chapter, would be different. That here, in this quiet little corner of the world, she could finally find the sense of community and belonging that she craved. But instead, it felt like she had stepped into a place where the walls were even higher, the suspicion even thicker. As the evening wore on, Denise tried to push the incident out of her mind. She made herself a cup of tea and settled into the living room with a book, determined not to let this ruin her peace. But as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet of the neighborhood, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt eerie. It was as if every window was watching her, every house silently judging her presence. The next day, Denise woke early, hoping to get ahead of the unease that had settled over her. She decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping that maybe a little fresh air would clear her head. As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted her, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant sound of birds singing. She walked slowly down the street, taking in the sights of the neatly kept houses, the carefully manicured lawns. Everything looked perfect, almost too perfect, like a picture out of a magazine. But beneath the surface, Denise knew, there was something more, something darker. She could feel it in the way the neighbors glanced at her as they walked their dogs or worked in their gardens. The way conversations seemed to stop when she passed by, as if her very presence was an interruption. As she walked, Denise noticed a familiar face across the street. It was Mrs. Sutton, the same woman who had so coldly refused her cookies the day before. Mrs. Sutton was standing in her front yard, watering her flowers. Denise considered crossing the street to try and speak with her again, but something in the way the woman glanced at her, quick and sharp, like a dagger, made her hesitate. Instead, Denise continued walking, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure what to do next. Should she try harder to fit in, to win over her neighbors with kindness and patience, or should she keep her distance, protecting herself from further rejection? Just as she was about to turn the corner, she heard the sound of a car pulling up beside her. She glanced over and saw a sleek, black SUV slowing to a stop. The window rolled down, and a man leaned out, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses. "Hey, you," the man called out, his voice sharp. Denise froze, unsure whether he was talking to her. She turned slightly, her heart beating a little faster. "Yeah, you," he repeated, louder this time. "What are you doing around here?" Denise swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "I live here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man tilted his head, his sunglasses reflecting the morning light. "Oh, really? Haven't seen you around before." Denise felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I just moved in," she replied, keeping her tone calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" The man stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Then, without another word, he rolled up his window and drove off, leaving Denise standing there in the street, her heart pounding in her chest. It was only after he had disappeared around the corner that Denise realized her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the encounter had left her rattled. It was as if the entire neighborhood was watching her, waiting for her to slip up, to give them a reason to push her out. Denise turned and walked back toward her house, her steps quick and purposeful. She had come here for a fresh start, for peace, But it was becoming clear that this place, with its perfect lawns and pristine houses, was hiding something far more insidious, a quiet, unspoken hostility that threatened to consume her if she wasn't careful. As she reached her front door, Denise made a decision. She wasn't going to let them push her out. Not this time. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to be intimidated by a few narrow-minded neighbors. She would stay, she would fight, and she would prove that she belonged, whether they liked it or not. Shattered illusions. The sun rose on the third day since the incident, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. But for Denise, the light felt hollow, a sharp contrast to the cold reception she'd received since moving in. Sitting at her kitchen table, she stared down at her cup of coffee, her thoughts spiraling. I should feel at home by now, she thought. But why does it feel like I'm intruding in my own space? Her home was exactly what she had wanted, a modest, charming house in a serene neighborhood, far from the chaos of the city. She had saved for years, sacrificed vacations, dinners out, and even delayed a promotion to afford it. This was supposed to be her sanctuary. Instead, it had become a battleground for invisible hostilities. She glanced at the clock. 8:45 a.m. Her phone buzzed with a notification from her work calendar, reminding her of the virtual team meeting she had in 15 minutes. Denise felt a wave of relief wash over her. Work had always been her escape. It was a place where her competence, intelligence, and dedication were recognized, where she felt seen, not as a black woman, but as Denise, the reliable project manager. She logged into the meeting and greeted her team with a bright smile. For the next hour, she lost herself in discussions about deadlines, deliverables, and strategic planning. The voices of her colleagues, though distant, provided a comforting normalcy she desperately needed. For a brief time, she was able to forget about the neighborhood's silent judgment. But as the meeting ended and the screen went dark, reality came crashing back. The house, which had once seemed cozy, now felt oppressive, its walls closing in on her. Denise stood up, stretching, trying to shake off the unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She decided to take a walk around the block, hoping to clear her head and maybe even extend an olive branch to some of the neighbors she hadn't yet met. As she walked down her street, she noticed a few of the neighborhood children playing in a front yard. Their laughter was infectious, a stark contrast to the tense encounters she had faced over the past few days. Denise smiled softly, remembering her own childhood in a much busier part of the city. Back then, the streets were noisy, bustling with life, but it felt like home. This place, in all its quiet perfection, felt anything but. Denise's thoughts were interrupted when she spotted Mrs. Sutton again, watering her plants. This time, the older woman looked up and caught Denise's gaze. For a moment, they stood there, staring at one another, the tension between them palpable. Denise took a deep breath, her determination flaring. She wasn't going to let fear or discomfort keep her from trying. She crossed the street, her steps measured but purposeful. "Good morning, Mrs. Sutton," Denise called out as she approached. The older woman blinked, clearly surprised by the greeting. She hesitated for a moment before offering a curt nod. "Good morning. I'm sorry if I came across too strong the other day," Denise said, her voice even. "I didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable. I just wanted to introduce myself and offer some cookies. It's a tradition I've always enjoyed." Mrs. Sutton's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained guarded. "I suppose it was just unexpected. People here tend to keep to themselves." Denise smiled, though she could feel the weight of Mrs. Sutton's words. Keep to themselves. It was the perfect euphemism for the cold isolation she had felt since moving in. "I understand," Denise replied, "but I was hoping to get to know my neighbors a little better. It's important to me to feel connected to the community." Mrs. Sutton shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward her house as if searching for an escape. "Well, I suppose we're not used to that kind of friendliness around here. People don't always trust newcomers." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Denise could feel the undercurrent, Newcomers, especially those who didn't quite fit the unspoken mold of this neighborhood, weren't easily accepted. "I guess it'll take some time then," Denise said, her smile unwavering despite the sting of the exchange. "But I'm willing to be patient." Mrs. Sutton gave another tight nod before turning her attention back to her plants. Denise lingered for a moment longer, waiting to see if the older woman would offer anything more. An invitation, a hint of friendliness. But none came. The conversation was over before it had really begun. Denise walked away, feeling the familiar ache of rejection settle in her chest. No matter how polite or accommodating she tried to be, there always seemed to be an invisible barrier. It was the kind of unspoken racism she had experienced her entire life. The kind that wasn't overt or aggressive, but subtle and pervasive, like a quiet current pulling her under. Back at her house, Denise sat on the porch steps, watching the neighborhood move around her. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly, but the warmth did little to thaw the icy atmosphere she felt every time she stepped outside. As she sat there, lost in thought, a sudden movement caught her eye. A young boy, no more than 10 or 11, was riding his bike up the street. He glanced in her direction, his face lighting up with curiosity. He slowed down as he approached her house, eventually stopping at the end of her driveway. "Hi," he called out, his voice full of innocent enthusiasm. Denise smiled, grateful for the break in tension. "Hi there. Nice bike you've got." The boy grinned, clearly pleased with the compliment. "Thanks. I just got it for my birthday." "That's awesome. Happy belated birthday," Denise replied warmly. The boy beamed before glancing around nervously. "I haven't seen you around before. Are you new?" "Yeah, I just moved in a few days ago," Denise said, her heart lifting at the boy's openness. "I'm Denise." "I'm Caleb," the boy replied, leaning his bike against his leg. "Do you have any kids? I don't have many friends around here, so I was hoping." Denise's smile widened at his innocence. "No kids, unfortunately, but I'm sure we'll see each other around. Maybe you can show me the best spots in the neighborhood." Caleb's eyes lit up at the prospect. "Yeah, there's this cool park down the street, and sometimes the ice cream truck comes by. I'll have to check it out," Denise said, genuinely touched by his friendliness. Their conversation was cut short when a woman's voice called out from down the street, "Caleb, come inside now." Denise looked up to see a woman standing at the door of a house a few doors down, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It didn't take long for Denise to realize that the woman was Caleb's mother. Her eyes were fixed on Denise, her expression hard and unwelcoming. Caleb waved awkwardly before hopping back on his bike. "I gotta go. Maybe I'll see you later." "Sure thing," Denise said, waving as he rode off. But the momentary joy she had felt quickly evaporated as she watched Caleb's mother pull him inside the house without so much as a glance in Denise's direction. The message was clear. Even the children in this neighborhood weren't immune to the influence of their parents' unspoken biases. Denise stood up, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. It was exhausting, this constant dance of trying to prove herself, to show that she was no threat, no different from anyone else. She had fought her whole life to break through these barriers, and yet here she was again, facing the same old walls, just in a new place. As she walked back inside, closing the door behind her, Denise made a silent vow. She wasn't going to be pushed into the shadows of this community. She wasn't going to let them dictate her sense of belonging. If this neighborhood was going to be her home, she would make them see her, whether they liked it or not. The knock at the door. The days following Denise's interaction with Mrs. Sutton were much the same. The weather remained warm, but the coldness from the neighbors persisted. Every morning, Denise would step outside, determined to greet at least one person, offer a smile or wave, but the response was always distant. People avoided her gaze, kept their conversations brief, or simply crossed the street to avoid her entirely. But today was different. It was a Saturday morning, and Denise had decided to spend her day planting flowers in her front yard. Gardening had always been a therapeutic escape for her, a way to nurture life while losing herself in the repetitive motion of digging and planting. She picked up some tulips and daffodil bulbs the day before, hoping that a burst of color in her yard might at least draw some friendly conversation from the neighbors. As she knelt down, gently placing the bulbs into the soil, she found herself thinking about Caleb. The boy's kindness had been a refreshing change, a brief moment of light in what had felt like a dark tunnel of rejection. She hadn't seen him since that day on the bike, but she hoped they'd cross paths again. Maybe I should bring cookies to his house next time, she thought with a small smile. But then the memory of his mother's hard stare came back, and the smile faded. Maybe not. Denise was about halfway through planting when she heard a voice call out from across the street, "Hey there." She looked up, surprised. It was a woman she hadn't seen before, standing on the sidewalk with a small dog on a leash. The woman had curly brown hair and was dressed in yoga pants and a bright pink hoodie. Her face lit up with a friendly smile. "Hi," Denise replied, standing up and wiping her dirt-stained hands on her jeans. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The woman nodded enthusiastically. "Perfect for planting. Those flowers are going to look amazing. I'm Claire, by the way. I live just a few houses down." Denise smiled, her heart lifting at the sudden friendliness. "I'm Denise. I just moved in a couple of weeks ago." "Welcome to the neighborhood," Claire said, walking closer and extending her hand. Denise shook it, grateful for the warmth of her gesture. "Sorry it's taken me so long to come by and introduce myself. Things have been crazy with work and all, but I've been meaning to say hello." "No worries at all," Denise said, her smile widening. "It's nice to finally meet someone. I've been trying to get to know people around here, but it's been a little tough." Claire sighed, a sympathetic look crossing her face. "Yeah, this neighborhood can be a bit reserved. A lot of folks here have been living in these houses for years, and they're not exactly used to newcomers." Denise appreciated the candidness. "That's the impression I've been getting," she said, nodding. "But I'm hoping to change that." Claire laughed lightly. "Good for you. I'm sure you will. Just give it some time. People here might be slow to warm up, but once they do, they're pretty loyal." Denise felt a glimmer of hope. Claire's friendliness was like a breath of fresh air, a sign that maybe, just maybe, things would start to turn around. They chatted for a few more minutes about gardening, the best spots for groceries, and local dog parks. Claire's dog, a small terrier named Rosie, kept trying to get into Denise's flower bed, making them both laugh. "I should probably get going before Rosie ruins all your hard work," Claire said, giving the leash a gentle tug. "But it was really nice meeting you, Denise. I'll stop by again sometime, and maybe we can have a proper chat over coffee." "I'd love that," Denise replied, feeling lighter than she had in days. "Thanks again for saying hello." Claire waved as she walked away, and for the first time since moving in, Denise felt a genuine connection with someone in the neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The rest of the day passed peacefully, and Denise found herself humming as she finished up her gardening. She spent the evening curled up on the couch with a book, feeling more at ease than she had in weeks. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe it would just take some time for people to warm up to her. But later that night, just as Denise was about to go to bed, there was a knock at the door. It was unusual for anyone to visit her at this hour. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was nearly 11 p.m. Her heart skipped a beat, the sudden anxiety making her stomach twist. Who could it be at this time? She wondered, heading cautiously toward the door. She peeked through the window and saw 2 police officers standing on her porch, their faces serious. A cold chill ran down her spine. She quickly unlocked the door and opened it, her mind racing. "Good evening, officers. Is everything all right?" One of the officers, a tall man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. "Good evening, ma'am. Are you Denise Carter?" "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" Denise asked, her voice steady despite the rising fear in her chest. The second officer, a woman with short blonde hair, spoke next. "We received a call about a disturbance in the neighborhood. Someone reported unusual activity at this address." Denise blinked in confusion. "A disturbance? I'm sorry, but I haven't heard or seen anything unusual tonight." The male officer's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The call mentioned that there was suspicious behavior at this house, possibly involving a break-in or trespassing. Denise's heart sank. A break-in. She hadn't heard anything like that. She hadn't even left the house since earlier in the afternoon, and there had been no sign of trouble when she came inside. "I've been home all day," she said, her voice firm. "I've been gardening and reading most of the evening. No one's broken in, and I haven't seen anyone acting suspicious around here." The female officer exchanged a glance with her partner before nodding. "We just wanted to check in and make sure everything was all right. It's possible the call was a false alarm." Denise felt a surge of frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She knew what this was. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. The disturbance call, the sudden police presence at her door, it was all part of the same underlying suspicion she had felt from the moment she moved in. Someone in the neighborhood had called the police on her, and it wasn't because of any real disturbance. It was because she was black. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. "Thank you for checking in, officers," Denise said, her tone measured. "But everything here is fine." The male officer nodded. "All right, ma'am. If anything changes or you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to give us a call." "Will do," Denise replied, forcing a polite smile. As the officers turned to leave, Denise stood in the doorway, watching them walk back to their patrol car. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just about a false report. It was about being seen as a threat in her own home, in her own neighborhood. It was about the deep-seated prejudices that followed her no matter where she went, no matter how hard she worked to prove herself. She closed the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment as she tried to steady her breathing. The weight of it all, the whispers, the cold stares, the police visit, pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Denise walked back to the living room, her mind racing. Who had made the call? Was it Mrs. Sutton, or maybe Caleb's mother? Or had it been someone else entirely? Someone she hadn't even noticed watching her from behind drawn curtains. The sense of isolation returned with a vengeance, but this time it wasn't just about being left out of the community. It was about being targeted, singled out because of the color of her skin. Denise sank into the couch, staring blankly at the wall. She had come here for peace, for a fresh start. But now it seemed like she was fighting the same battle she had faced all her life. The only difference was the setting. But as the minutes ticked by, her sadness began to morph into something else, something stronger. She wasn't going to let them push her out, no matter how many calls they made or how many police visits she had to endure. This was her home now, and she had every right to be here. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were wrong. She had faced far worse in her life, and she wasn't about to back down now. With renewed resolve, Denise stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark, quiet street. It was time to stop trying to fit in. If they wouldn't accept her for who she was, then she would make them see her anyway, whether they liked it or not. Standing her ground. The next morning, Denise woke up with the events of the previous night still weighing heavily on her mind. She had barely slept, her thoughts swirling with questions and frustrations. Who had called the police on her? And why? Was it really just because she was black? The thought gnawed at her, but deep down, she already knew the answer. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting warm beams of light across her bedroom, but it did little to ease the tension she felt. This neighborhood was supposed to be her refuge, her new beginning. She had bought this house with the hope of building a life in a community that she believed would welcome her. Yet here she was, feeling like an outsider in her own home. Still, Denise had never been one to give up easily. She wasn't about to let the ignorance of a few people make her feel unsafe or unwelcome. Her father had always told her, "You can't control what other people think, but you can control how you respond to it." She remembered how he taught her to be proud of who she was, no matter what the world threw at her. That strength had carried her through many hardships, and it would carry her through this too. After a quick breakfast, Denise decided to confront the situation head-on. If someone had a problem with her, they would have to face her directly. She wasn't going to tiptoe around, afraid of what others might say or do. She was done trying to quietly fit into a place that seemed determined to reject her. Her first stop was Mrs. Sutton's house. Denise didn't know for sure if it had been the elderly woman who had called the police, but she had a hunch. Mrs. Sutton was always watching from her porch, her suspicious eyes constantly following Denise's every move. If anyone had seen suspicious behavior, it was likely her. Denise crossed the street, her steps firm, her heart pounding with a mix of nervousness and determination. She knew this might not go well, but she couldn't just sit around and do nothing. When she reached Mrs. Sutton's house, she took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It took a moment, but eventually the door creaked open, and Mrs. Sutton appeared, peering out from behind the screen door. Her face was a mix of confusion and annoyance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp. Denise didn't waste any time. "Good morning, Mrs. Sutton. I wanted to ask if you were the one who called the police on me last night." Mrs. Sutton blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a direct question. For a moment, she said nothing, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. I don't know what you're talking about," she finally stammered, her eyes shifting to the side. Denise wasn't buying it. "The police said they got a report of suspicious activity at my house. I've only been here a few weeks, and the only suspicious thing I've done is plant some flowers in my yard. So I thought I'd come and ask you directly." Mrs. Sutton's face flushed slightly, and she crossed her arms defensively. I don't think it's appropriate for you to accuse me of something like that. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, and I know when something isn't right. There have been incidents in this area before. We have to be careful." "Careful of what?" Denise asked, her voice calm but firm. "Of a black woman living in your neighborhood." Mrs. Sutton stiffened, her lips thinning into a tight line. "It's not about that," she snapped. "It's about making sure everyone is safe. We have to look out for each other." Denise stared at her, the frustration she had been holding back bubbling to the surface. "Look, Mrs. Sutton, I'm not here to cause trouble. I moved here because I wanted a peaceful life, just like you. I've done nothing to make anyone feel unsafe, and yet somehow I'm being treated like a criminal. I just want to be treated like any other neighbor. Is that too much to ask?" Mrs. Sutton shifted uncomfortably, her gaze avoiding Denise's. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Then, finally, she muttered, "It wasn't me who called the police." Denise raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" The older woman sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Maybe I've been watching too closely, but it's not easy to trust people these days. You don't know what it's been like here all these years. The world's changing, and it's hard to keep up." Denise softened slightly, understanding the fear beneath the suspicion, though she didn't condone it. "I get that things are changing, Mrs. Sutton, but we can't go around assuming the worst about people just because they're different. If we do, we'll never actually get to know each other." Mrs. Sutton said nothing, but her face seemed to relax just a bit. Denise took it as a small victory. "I'm not here to cause problems," Denise continued. "I'm here to build a life, just like everyone else. I hope in time we can be good neighbors." Without waiting for a reply, Denise gave a small nod and turned to leave. As she walked back to her house, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, but also a sense of empowerment. She had stood her ground, and while Mrs. Sutton hadn't admitted to making the call, Denise could tell she had made her think. But Denise wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, she decided to take another bold step. She baked a fresh batch of cookies, chocolate chip, the kind her grandmother used to make, and put them in a tin. With a deep breath, she set out to visit another neighbor, one who had been particularly cold to her since she moved in, Caleb's mother. The encounter with Mrs. Sutton had been nerve-wracking, but this one felt even more daunting. Caleb's mother, Jennifer, had made her disapproval of Denise clear from the very beginning. Her sharp looks and avoidance were unmistakable, and Denise knew this interaction could easily turn hostile. But she had to try. She knocked on the door, feeling her heart race in her chest. After a few moments, Jennifer answered, her face immediately hardening when she saw who it was. "Denise," she said curtly. "Hi, Jennifer," Denise said, her voice steady. "I wanted to come by and introduce myself properly. I brought some cookies." Jennifer's eyes flicked to the tin in Denise's hands, and for a moment, something softened in her expression. But it was quickly replaced by the same cold distance Denise had come to expect. "You didn't need to do that," Jennifer said, though she didn't invite her in. Denise held her ground, offering the cookies with a warm smile. "I know, but I wanted to. I'm hoping we can get to know each other a little better. Caleb seems like a sweet boy, and I thought it would be nice if we could have a fresh start." Jennifer hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to assess Denise's intentions. Finally, she sighed and took the tin from Denise's hands, albeit reluctantly. "Thank you. I'll make sure Caleb gets one." There was an awkward silence, and Denise realized she wasn't going to get much more from Jennifer today. But at least she had made the effort. "Well, I won't keep you," Denise said, turning to leave. "Have a great day." As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step toward breaking down the walls that had been built between her and the people in this neighborhood. And while it might take time, she was determined to keep pushing forward. By the time she returned to her house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. Denise stood in her front yard for a moment, taking in the scene. The tulips she had planted were starting to sprout, tiny green shoots breaking through the soil. It was a small but powerful reminder that growth takes time, and sometimes it happens in the most unexpected ways. Denise smiled to herself, feeling the new sense of determination. She wasn't going to let fear or prejudice define her experience here. She would continue to stand her ground, to reach out, and to live her life with pride and dignity. And if anyone had a problem with that, it was their problem, not hers. The ripple effect. In the days that followed, something began to shift in the neighborhood, though it was subtle at first. Denise's confrontation with Mrs. Sutton and her olive branch to Jennifer didn't cause any immediate transformations, but they had planted seeds, seeds of doubt, curiosity, and maybe even the beginnings of change. Denise continued to live her life as she always had, refusing to let fear or ignorance dictate her actions, but something about her quiet resilience was beginning to have a ripple effect. She noticed small things at first. Caleb, the boy from next door, no longer stared at her house with wide-eyed suspicion. Instead, he smiled shyly whenever he saw her in the yard. One afternoon, while Denise was trimming the hedges, Caleb even wandered over with a soccer ball under his arm. "Hi, Miss Denise," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Denise looked up, surprised but pleased. "Hey there, Caleb. What's up?" Caleb shuffled his feet, looking down at the ground. "I was just wondering, could you maybe play soccer with me? Mom's busy, and she said I should go outside." Denise smiled warmly, setting down her gardening shears. "I'd love to, Caleb. Let me just wash up real quick, and we can kick the ball around." For the next half hour, they played in the yard, Caleb's laughter filling the air as Denise chased after the ball, pretending to be hopeless at the game. It was a simple interaction, but to Denise, it meant everything. It was a sign that, at least with Caleb, she had broken through some of the barriers that had kept them apart. It reminded her of the power of small gestures, how even the tiniest connections could bridge the widest divides. As the days passed, Denise continued her routine: gardening, going to work, chatting with her neighbors when she could. She wasn't trying to change anyone's mind overnight, but she remained open, approachable, and above all, herself. Her authenticity, her refusal to be anything other than who she was, began to resonate with those around her, whether they wanted to admit it or not. But not everyone was as receptive as Caleb. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Denise decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. She enjoyed the quiet stillness of the early evening, the way the fading light cast long shadows over the tree-lined streets. It was peaceful, and she needed that peace after the turmoil of the past few weeks. As she rounded a corner, however, she spotted a group of her neighbors standing on a lawn, deep in conversation. Among them was Jennifer, Caleb's mother, and a few other women from the block. They hadn't noticed her yet, and as she drew closer, she overheard snippets of their conversation. "She just shows up here, acting like she belongs," one of the women was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. "I mean, I get that times are changing, but this is still our neighborhood." Jennifer, to Denise's disappointment, didn't disagree. Instead, she nodded slightly, her arms crossed. "I don't know what to make of her," she muttered. "She seems nice enough, but it's just different." Denise's heart sank as she listened. She had hoped that her interactions with Jennifer, especially the cookies, had made a difference, but clearly there was still a long way to go. The hurt of their words stung, but Denise didn't let it consume her. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the fear of change, the discomfort that came with confronting long-held biases. She thought about turning around and walking the other way, but something stopped her. This was her neighborhood too. She wasn't going to slink away in shame just because some people couldn't accept her. So with her head held high, Denise walked straight past the group, her steps confident, her gaze fixed ahead. She could feel their eyes on her, their whispers fading as she moved past them. When she reached her house, she stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. She reminded herself that change was never easy, and it often came with resistance. She couldn't control what her neighbors thought or said about her, but she could control how she responded. And her response was clear: she wasn't going anywhere. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Denise had just finished her weekly trip to the grocery store when she noticed something odd in her mailbox. Nestled among the usual bills and advertisements was a handwritten envelope with no return address. Curious, she opened it and unfolded the note inside. "Dear Denise," it began, "I just wanted to say thank you for the cookies the other day. I wasn't sure what to think of you at first, and I'm still figuring things out, but I realize I haven't been fair. You seem like a good person, and Caleb really likes you. Maybe we could start over. I'd like to get to know you better. Jennifer." Denise read the note twice, her heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step in the right direction. Jennifer was reaching out, acknowledging that she hadn't been entirely fair. It was more than Denise had expected, and it filled her with a cautious sense of hope. The following weekend, Jennifer invited Denise over for coffee. The conversation was tentative at first, both women unsure of how to navigate the tension that had previously existed between them. But as they talked, they found common ground. They both loved gardening, and Caleb had been raving about how fun it had been playing soccer with Denise. "I guess I've been overprotective," Jennifer admitted at one point, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "It's just, things have been tough for me since Caleb's dad left. I'm trying to keep everything together, and I worry about him a lot." Denise nodded, understanding more than Jennifer realized. "I get it," she said softly. "Being a single parent is tough, and sometimes we project our fears onto the wrong things. But we're neighbors, and I'd like to help if I can. We don't have to be strangers." Jennifer smiled, though it was a bit hesitant. "I'd like that too." From that day on, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly but surely, Denise became more than just the new neighbor. Caleb started coming over regularly, and Denise found herself spending more time with Jennifer, exchanging gardening tips, and even having dinner together from time to time. Mrs. Sutton, while still a bit prickly, had softened too. Denise noticed that the elderly woman waved now whenever she saw her, a small but significant gesture of goodwill. Word spread around the neighborhood about Denise, about how she had reached out despite the coldness, how she had made an effort to connect, even when it wasn't reciprocated. People started to see her not as a threat or an outsider, but as a person, a neighbor, and eventually, a friend. And then, one evening, something truly extraordinary happened. Denise was sitting on her porch, watching the sunset, when a car pulled up in front of her house. Out stepped a man she had never seen before, tall and imposing, his face set in a serious expression. He approached her slowly, and Denise's heart raced. Was this someone else coming to challenge her right to be here? But as the man drew closer, she saw something in his eyes. Regret, maybe even guilt. He cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice low. But I'm the one who called the cops on you that night. Denise's breath caught in her throat, but she remained silent, letting him continue. I thought you didn't belong here, he admitted, shame coloring his voice. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, but I was wrong. I see that now. Denise watched him closely, her emotions swirling. She had waited weeks to know who had called the police on her, but now that the moment had come, she didn't feel the anger she had expected. Instead, she felt a strange sense of relief. The man took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Denise. I shouldn't have judged you without knowing you. I've seen how you've treated everyone here, with kindness, even when we didn't deserve it. I hope you can forgive me. Denise looked at him for a long moment before offering a small smile. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I appreciate that. He nodded, visibly relieved. I'll try to do better. As he walked away, Denise felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The chapter that had started with fear and suspicion was finally coming to an end, and in its place, a new chapter was beginning. One filled with hope, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, community. Denise sat back on her porch, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet now, peaceful in a way that felt different from when she had first arrived. She had fought for her place here, not with anger or bitterness, but with grace, perseverance, and compassion. And in the end, that was what had changed everything.